Skeptical critics like Bart Ehrman tell us that we have no idea who wrote the Gospel according to Matthew. These critics will argue that all the internal evidence tells us that it had to have been written by somebody else. But is that really the case? The Gospels tell us that Matthew is a tax collector, so if Matthew did write a Gospel, we'd expect to see an unusual degree of interest in financial matters. And as it turns out, that's exactly what we find to be the case. Matthew is all about the Benjamins, much more so than any other Gospel writer, and it isn't even particularly close. When we add up all the references to money in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, here's what we get. Gospel according to Luke, 22 mentions, Mark, 6, Matthew, 44. Let's take a look at some of the nitty-gritty details. For starters, only Matthew records the story of Jesus paying the temple tax. Matthew uses a different Greek word to describe their job in comparison to his, to point out that they weren't hired by the Romans. Jesus also makes the point that the king's son get tax exemption, but he doesn't want to offend them. So he sends Peter off on an unusual errand and has him go fishing. He said that the first fish Peter would catch would have a stater in its mouth. Now, we know from history that a stater is a 4 drachma coin, enough to pay both Peter and Jesus' temple tax. What's extra noteworthy here is that Matthew is the only gospel writer to mention both of these coins. Let's take a look at another example. Matthew is the only gospel writer to include the parable of the vineyard workers. Jesus taught that the person who worked 1 hour would get a denarius. That's an entire day's wage, and the same amount that the person who got paid who worked from sunup to sundown in the parable. That's not the normal way people deal with money, and it must have stood out to a guy like Matthew. As it turns out, a denarius is the correct day's wage at the time, historically speaking. This shows that Matthew really knew his stuff. Matthew is also the only gospel writer to record Jesus' parable of the unmerciful servant. The king's servant owed him 10,000 talents. According to Epiphanius, the talent is called a mina by the Hebrews and was equal in weight to 100 denarii. This was a boatload of bills, more money than what Judah paid in tribute to Rome every year by a lot. The king forgave this ridiculously huge debt, but the servant went on to throw someone in jail for owing him 100 denarii. We all get the lesson, but this must have especially stood out to an exacting tax collector like Matthew. He's also the only gospel writer to use the word talent, and he uses it in his gospel 14 times. But wait, there's a whole lot more. Matthew, Mark, and Luke record sending the 12 to preach the gospel out to the nation of Israel. Mark writes, "Take no money in their belts." Luke phrases it, "Take no money." Matthew gets very oddly specific. He uses 3 terms, writing, "Do not acquire gold, silver, or copper." It isn't really hard to imagine a money-reliant Matthew thinking, wow, take no money, Jesus? I mean, really? Not even the copper? Not even my spare change? You really meant that seek first the kingdom stuff, didn't you? Now, Matthew is also the only evangelist to record that the Pharisees used to swear by the gold in the temple. Mark and Luke never even use the word gold, but Matthew mentions it 5 different times. It would also be difficult to know about this tradition if you never lived in Jerusalem before 70 AD when the temple was destroyed. Matthew is also the only gospel writer who reports the exact payment made to Judas, 30 pieces of silver. Matthew is also the only evangelist who tells us about the hush money paid to the guards at the tomb. And Matthew's version of the Lord's Prayer has Jesus saying, "Forgive us our debts," while Luke's version reads, "Forgive us our sins." The Greek word in Matthew's version refers to due wages. Finally, Matthew gets ultra precise when he uses the word quadrans in Matthew 5:25 through 26. In the parallel passage, Luke phrases it different and he uses the word lepton. Lepton is more of a generic term of a Roman small value coin, but Matthew uses the exact name for the coin. We get 4 lists of the 12 disciples in the New Testament. Matthew lists himself last, calling himself Matthew the tax collector. The other lists leave out his unflattering occupation, but Matthew keeps it real. The story of Matthew's calling is also in all 3 synoptic gospels. Besides the calling of Peter and Andrew, it's the only other story of a disciple's calling that's made into a big deal. Why exactly is that the case? Well, I'd have to think that based on the evidence, the early church knew that Matthew was Jesus' biographer. And oddly enough, Matthew's version of his call mentions Matthew's house in an interesting way. Luke and Mark just call it his house or Levi's house, while Matthew gets a little more modest. He says, "in the house." Matthew, being a humble guy and all, gets the attention off of himself. All of the manuscript evidence and testimony that we have from the early church show that Matthew is the genuine author. We've looked at this earlier. Combine that with these little internal clues, and the idea that Matthew is the genuine author of his gospel seems to be right on the money. Really lame pun intended.